I remember that morning with a peculiar clarity, though it began as unremarkable as any other in Oxford. The rain had fallen overnight, leaving the stone of Radcliffe Square slick and dark, the spires and domes half hidden behind a mist that seemed to curl like smoke from some distant hearth. I walked slowly, my coat collar turned up against the chill, each footstep muffled against the cobbled stones, the echo of a distant bell marking the hour. There was something in the light or the lack of it that made the familiar seem strange, as if the city itself had been holding its breath, waiting. A newspaper lay, abandoned, on a bench beneath one of the chestnut trees. I paused, noticing the headline before I meant Professor found dead under mysterious circumstances. The name, Alistair Penn, was one I recognized vaguely as an Oxford don, respected, perhaps even admired, though not without his critics. I unfolded the paper carefully, aware of how quickly words can mislead. The report suggested an accident, a fall down some stairs, but the phrasing was odd, oblique, hinting at more than it admitted. The phrasing drew my attention to the margins, to the almost imperceptible annotation in pencil, perhaps a student's or a colleague's. Something about it whispered of concealment. I moved on, keeping my eyes on the square. The tourists had begun to trickle in, umbrellas bobbing in the damp, yet I scarcely noticed them. My mind, as it often does in such moments, wandered to architecture and memory rather than the immediate reality. The Radcliffe camera, circular and solemn, seemed to float in the mist, a miniature moon grounded on stone, its windows darkened. There was a precision to the arches that called to the part of me that delighted in symmetry, in the mathematics of human endeavour. But even beauty, I thought, could conceal a subtle cruelty. Crossing the square, I recalled the gentle murmurs of conversation from a lecture I had attended the previous term, and the faint dissonance between polite academic civility and the passions it often concealed. I imagined Penn at high table, the evening before his death, glass raised in ceremonial toast, masking whatever tension simmered behind measured smiles. The university, I realized, is often a theatre of restrained rivalries, where ego and intellect dance with secrecy. I paused near a lamp-post, glancing down a side passage between the college buildings. The mist made the world seem smaller, enclosed, intimate. Here was a space that encouraged attention to small things, a mislaid glove, a dropped letter, a shadow, that lingered a moment too long. And my eyes, as they often did, were drawn not to the obvious, but to what others overlooked. The faint imprint of mud on the hem of a gown, the tilt of a hat, the way a figure moved as if rehearsing gestures for an audience that was never there. Details, so easily dismissed, were often the first stirrings of truth. A thought came, unbidden, about an old crossword. From the Times, the clues about obscure poets and long-dead composers. I remembered one in particular, hidden beneath the symmetry, a secret revealed by the fall. I chuckled quietly at the connection, half frustrated with myself for seeing metaphors everywhere. And yet there was something in that line that made the hair on my neck prickle, the sense that accidents are rarely simple, that elegance can hide menace. By the time I reached the periphery of the square, I felt the weight of observation settle on me, a familiar melancholy. The city was waking, indifferent, while I carried a private unease, the first threads of a puzzle that would occupy weeks. Somewhere, Dr. Penn's death had begun to pull at its subtle tethers, drawing me into corners and corridors where quiet intentions and whispered resentments intersected. I did not yet know the full tapestry, but even at this distance I sensed the intricate pattern forming beneath the calm facade of Oxford stone and rain. I recall entering Balliol that morning with the air of a man who had wandered into a familiar room and found it slightly altered, the light falling differently through the cloister arches, casting long, deliberate shadows across the worn stone floor. The smell of damp paper and polished oak drifted faintly from the library, mingling with the metallic tang of rain on the stone. It was a smell that Oxford knows well, one that carries the weight of countless hours of study and unspoken rivalries. I walked slowly, noting the way a porter moved along the corridor, his steps uneven, as if he had rehearsed them to appear casual, yet remained conspicuously alert. Dr. Penn's chambers were immediately recognizable, despite the careful tidying that had clearly taken place after his death. The desk was stripped of its usual clutter, except for a diary left deliberately open at a page that seemed, at first, mundane. The spine of an opera score peered from a shelf, and a small, folded note lay tucked beneath it. I picked it up, careful not to disturb the pencil annotations in the margins, and read a line that seemed to tremble between jest and threat. "Remember the toast, lest it be forgotten." The handwriting was precise, controlled, betraying no immediate emotion, and yet it hinted at a tension that had not been spoken aloud. I moved to the cloister, watching the fellows cross with purposeful indifference, their robes brushing lightly against the stone. There was an elegance in their gestures, each carefully measured, yet something in the cadence of their steps suggested concealed anxieties. I noted a visiting fellow whose eyes flicked too quickly toward a door he had no reason to approach, and a senior lecturer whose smile did not reach his eyes when he spoke of Penn. These were subtle things, easily dismissed by anyone else, but to me they carried the faint vibration of potential truths. I lingered near the staircase, noting the worn edges of the treads, their gloss uneven, from decades of careful passage. Here the mind often plays tricks, yet I found myself observing the minutiae of a tiny smudge on the banister, inconsistent with recent cleaning, a footprint too narrow, as if I hurried the faintest hint of mud on a gown's hem. The mind, left to wander in such spaces, begins to assemble narratives from fragments, and I felt that familiar quiet thrill, the sense that observation alone might illuminate the darkness. The porter, when I spoke with him, gave answers that were precise yet carefully neutral, as if each word had been weighed against some unseen ledger of propriety. He mentioned a quarrel, minor, academic, between Penn and another fellow about the allocation of rooms for visiting scholars. At first, it seemed trivial, the sort of petty disagreement that Oxford is full of, yet something in the phrasing, the careful avoidance of names, the emphasis on procedure over emotion, suggested he had seen more than he would admit. I filed it away, knowing the human mind often hides vital details in plain sight. A small fragment of a conversation reached me as I passed the fellow's garden words about a toast that had been deferred, laughter that carried too little warmth, a remark that misquoted Shelley in a way that seemed accidental, yet demanded attention. I paused, realizing that the repetition of certain lines, the almost imperceptible variations in phrasing, formed a lattice upon which the truth might rest. I noticed, too, a ledger on the corner of a side table, bound in leather and cracked with age. The date inscribed on its first page did not match the entry I had been told to expect. It was the sort of detail one could easily overlook a number, a comma, but it seemed to vibrate faintly with significance. I made a mental note to return to it, to consider its connection to the note beneath the opera score, and to the minor quarrels that, taken individually, appeared trivial, but collectively hinted at deeper currents. By the time I left the cloister, the sun had broken slightly through the mist, catching the wet stone in a brittle gleam. The city was waking more fully now, yet within those shadowed arches a silence remained, thick with possibilities. I walked on, carrying a sense that the college, with its solemn rituals and hidden resentments, had begun to offer up its secrets. And though none of them were yet fully formed, I felt the first stirrings of a path I would follow with quiet, relentless attention. I remember the lingering warmth of the high table hall, its dark oak panels absorbing the faint light from the tall windows, the faint smell of wine and polished floors mingling with the chill that seeped through the stone walls. It was there, in that room, that the echo of Dr. Penn's last toast still seemed to hover, as if the words themselves had refused to vanish. Colleagues spoke of it in measured tones, some claiming it had been a moment of mirth, others recalling a tension in his eyes, a hesitation that unsettled them more than they could articulate. I listened, noting the slight variations, the almost imperceptible tremor in their recollections, and began to pass what was said from what had been merely imagined or conveniently forgotten. It struck me how easily civility can mask discord. A fellow laughed as he spoke of the Don's customary eloquence, yet his eyes flickered toward another, perhaps a rival, with an unease that the laughter did not conceal. I caught the angle of the head, the subtle curl of a lip, the way a hand lingered near a glass a moment too long. Small gestures, so easily overlooked, that might betray more than words ever could. The room itself seemed to conspire, the long shadows accentuating the unspoken, the faint creak of a floorboard as someone adjusted in their seat, carrying more weight than mere movement. I made my way to the chairs once occupied by the witnesses, imagining Penn at the head of the table, raising his glass in that last careful gesture. Someone had remarked that he had seemed distracted, eyes drifting toward the window, as though measuring time against some private clock. I considered the note I had found earlier, its folded corners hinting at secrecy, and wondered if the toast had been more than a ceremonial message, perhaps, or a farewell in coded form. The thought was both melancholic and mildly thrilling, as if Oxford itself had provided a stage for subtle intrigue. The conversation veered toward minor quarrels, disagreements over lecture assignments, small resentments over academic precedents. Each participant chose words with careful precision, yet I noted the cadence, the phrasing, and the tiny inconsistencies that suggested more than they revealed. A misquoted line from Shakespeare floated into memory, repeated almost unconsciously, a detail that, if examined closely, might illuminate motive. These fragments, seemingly unconnected, began to flicker faintly in my mind, forming an outline that required patience and quiet attention. I observed the positioning of the chairs, the residue of wine on the oak, the faint smell of cigar smoke lingering in a corner where none should have been permitted. The triviality of these signs belied their potential significance. Each echo of a step or creak of a joint suggested a story, waiting for the patient ear to notice. I filed each anomaly away, knowing the mind often discovers connections in the unlikeliest details, a gesture, a pause, the angle of a glance. A minor moment caught my attention, the way one fellow's hand hovered near the toast's empty crystal for longer than propriety dictated. It was a subtle hesitation, almost imperceptible, but enough to make me consider the possibility that someone had not merely witnessed the Don's last words, but had been intimately entangled in their meaning. And there was the quiet thought, the whisper beneath the whisper, that the toast itself might conceal a truth, one that was at once both banal and devastating. I left the hall with the lingering sense that the Don's final performance was incomplete, that those who attended were unwitting actors in a play whose denouement remained unseen. Oxford's stone corridors seemed quieter now, the rain tapping gently against the window panes as I walked away, aware that subtlety, more than force, often reveals the hidden edges of human intent. I found the ticket tucked neatly between the pages of Penn's diary, almost ceremoniously, as though he had intended it to be found by someone who would understand its significance. It was for a Mozart performance at the Sheldonian, scheduled the evening before his death. At first glance it seemed a trivial memento of an evening of refinement, yet the precision of its placement, the care with which it had been preserved, suggested that it carried more weight than mere entertainment. The mind cannot help but dwell on these things, the habits of the meticulous, the messages conveyed without a word, the silent clues left in the routine of culture. I made my way to the Sheldonian in the thin rain, the arches of the theatre glistening, the stones worn smooth by centuries of footsteps. The memory of the audience, the hush before the orchestra began, seemed almost tangible. Music has a way of exposing character without utterance, revealing tension in posture, impatience in a shift of weight, emotion in the smallest movements. I remembered the scholars seated nearby, their expressions carefully managed, yet betraying the faintest signs of expectation, curiosity, or unease. Mozart's compositions, elegant and precise, provided a framework against which human idiosyncrasies stand out like ink on parchment. I spoke briefly with a faculty member who had attended the performance. He described Penn's delight in the first movement, his quiet absorption in the orchestration, the way he had seemed momentarily detached from the world. And then, almost as an afterthought, he mentioned the visiting soprano, a young woman of considerable talent whose presence had unsettled the usual hierarchy of attention. Her appearance, he said, had elicited small, almost imperceptible reactions in certain fellows, glances, pauses, gestures, that at the time seemed negligible but now began to take on significance. The opera itself seemed to echo the patterns of human behavior I had been observing. Themes repeated, variations concealed deeper truths, and resolutions arrived not always where one expected. In Penn's life, as in the music, the harmony may mask dissonance, and the elegance of a moment may veil a subtle rupture. I considered the ticket as a link, a tangible fragment connecting personal taste to social manoeuvring, a small object whose import exceeded its face value. I noted the careful inscription on the ticket's margin, almost invisible, as though left for discerning eye numbers, initials, a date slightly different from the performance's program. Something deliberate, though subtle, as if Penn had been marking not just attendance, but a sequence, a rhythm, a connection. I filed the detail away, sensing that the notation, together with the diary, the toast, and the misquoted lines, formed a lattice on which the case might one day be resolved. Walking back through the rain-soaked streets, I reflected on how music and mortality can intersect in strange ways. The human heart, fragile and precise, reacts to art as it does to deception, to beauty as it does to betrayal. Each movement in the opera mirrored, in some faint way, the relationships I was beginning to map, the rivalries, the whispered tensions, the quiet obsessions that Oxford preserves with almost sacred care. That night I returned to the diary, the opera ticket in hand, and considered its placement once more. There was a rhythm here, a cadence to be discerned, a silent dialogue between action and intention. And though the significance of it eluded me for the moment, I felt, as I often do in cases of subtle cruelty, that understanding would arrive not with a rush, but as a gradual illumination, a slow unravelling in the quiet spaces where human complexity resides. I remember discovering the lecture transcript in the quiet corner of the library, the faint smell of old paper and candle wax curling through the air, mingling with the mustiness of books long untouched. Penn's voice, preserved in ink and typeface, struck me with a curious resonance. He had misquoted Tennyson, a line familiar to me, yet altered in subtle ways that suggested more than mere oversight. The distortion was slightly missing word, an emphasis shifted, but in Oxford, as I had often found, such deviations carry intention, a whisper of personality, or perhaps a veiled communication. I read the line twice, carefully, tracing the rhythm of the words, the balance and imbalance that separated what was spoken from what was meant. It occurred to me that the misquote coincided almost too neatly with a series of meetings Penn had attended in the preceding weeks. Notes jotted in the margins of his diary hinted at scheduling conflicts, brief mentions of conversations that seemed trivial at the time, and yet, in light of this misquotation, they began to acquire a faint glow of significance. There was a pattern here, hidden beneath the veneer of ordinary academia, waiting for attention. The fellow who had quarrelled with Penn over curricular reform seemed, when I later spoke with him, unconsciously to echo the misquoted line in his own phrasing, unaware of the resonance it might have carried. His attention to detail, usually formidable, slipped. When recounting the Don's words, there was a hesitation, a flicker of recollection that did not align with his calm exterior. The small gesture of twisting a ring on his finger, subtle though it was, suggested more than mere nervousness. I noted it quietly, filing it alongside the misquote itself and the diary, sensing that these minor eccentricities were likely connected to the unspoken pressures within the college. A crossword had been left, as always, in the morning paper on the library table, its clues innocuous, yet satisfying to the cerebral mind. I paused over one that read, "Distorted lines conceal truth, 7. For reasons I could not immediately articulate, it struck a chord. I allowed myself the briefest smirk at the serendipity, recognizing that Penn's alteration of Tennyson might serve as a literary key, one that revealed more than a trivial misstep. It hinted at identity, at pride, at hidden communication among those who understood the language of subtlety and illusion. I wandered later through the Fellows' Garden, noting the long shadows cast by the late afternoon sun and the careful, deliberate movement of students and dons alike. Conversation floated across the grass, snippets of polite disagreement and cautious observation. I overheard a reference to a lecture that Penn had postponed, a debate over textual interpretation, the words misremembered yet lingering like fragments of a poem half recalled. The misquoted line returned in these whispers, the same subtle alteration I had observed in the transcript, suggesting its repetition was deliberate, a motif echoing through both speech and text. It was in the margin of a second transcript that I noticed the faint pencil mark, a tiny annotation, perhaps made by Penn himself, the number 22, circled with care beside the misquoted line. It seemed meaningless at first, but in the pattern of entries it appeared to index a series of correspondences and appointments, the alignment of dates and minor disputes. A trivial detail almost easily lost, yet it hinted at a chronology that might illuminate motive or sequence, if only I had the patience to assemble the pieces. Evening fell as I lingered in the cloister, the smell of rain on stone rising from the polished surfaces. I reflected on how a minor misquotation, an overlooked gesture, and a faint pencil mark could together suggest an architecture of thought, a lattice of interpersonal tensions invisible to all but the most attentive observer. Oxford thrives on the illusion of civility, yet beneath its decorum the currents of pride, jealousy, and unspoken desire move with quiet persistence. I sensed that the misquoted poet was not merely a literary idiosyncrasy, but a clue, one that would later illuminate a small, crucial truth about the events surrounding Dr. Penn's death. I left the library with a weight in my chest, not of conclusion, but of anticipation, aware that the smallest details, when observed with care, often reveal the deepest human complexities. And as the cloister emptied and the lamps flickered against the damp walls, I felt, as I often do, that the city itself holds a consciousness of its own, noticing what we overlook, whispering its secrets only to those who are willing to hear. I discovered the photograph, quite by accident, tucked between the pages of a leather-bound volume in the college library, its corners yellowed with age and the image itself a fragile sepia. It depicted Dr. Penn with a young man, perhaps a student, their postures casual but not without an air of deliberate composure. There was a faint inscription on the reverse, the ink faded but legible. Autumn 62, when the world seemed still. The words struck me with a quiet poignancy, as though they carried a weight of memory the subjects themselves had long since buried. I turned it over in my hands, aware of how easily such a trivial object might conceal a significance far greater than the eye first perceives. The image was unremarkable, yet the manner in which it had been hidden suggested intent. In a library such as this, a photograph is ordinarily public, catalogued, filed. This one, however, had been placed deliberately in a book no one would normally open, nestled among texts on medieval philosophy and ethics. It was, I realized, both a private memento and a secret message to those who might understand its context. Oxford is a city of layered meaning, and here was a fragment that demanded careful scrutiny. I examined the faces in the photograph, noting the subtle expressions and the tension in the young man's shoulders. Penn's smile was measured, almost imperceptibly controlled, and yet the eyes betrayed a hint of melancholy, an awareness of temporality, perhaps even regret. The student, in contrast, appeared more anxious or perhaps more alive to the ramifications of the moment captured. Such details, trivial to the casual observer, often contain the essence of what is later revealed as motive or fear. The placement of the photograph among the dusty tomes suggested a connection to Penn's private correspondences. I recalled the diary entries I had already reviewed, the penciled annotations and marginalia hinting at meetings and disagreements long past. The photograph, though silent, seemed to corroborate a hidden narrative, one of relationships formed in secrecy, of loyalties and resentments forged in the quiet corridors of learning. The past, in Oxford, is rarely extinguished. It lingers, pressing against the present in subtle, persistent ways. Later, as I traced the pathways Penn and his contemporaries would have taken, I found myself reflecting on the nature of secrecy in the college. The paths between buildings, the cloisters and gardens, the shadowed corners where one might whisper and remain unseen, all of it provided a stage for the human dramas preserved in photographs, letters, and memory. The image suggested a pact of some sort, a shared understanding that had survived decades yet remained unspoken. The implications of such a bond could not be dismissed lightly. I remembered a fleeting gesture observed in conversation with a senior fellow, the way his hand trembled slightly when the photograph was mentioned, as if recalling more than he intended. There was no overt admission, merely a pause, a faint tightening of the lips, the quick adjustment of a cuff. It was subtle, almost invisible, yet to an observer accustomed to nuance it hinted at discomfort, at guilt, or perhaps simply the memory of something too carefully preserved to be easily spoken. The photograph also drew my attention to chronology. The attire, the background, even the faint light in the image suggested a specific season, a specific year. When I cross-referenced it with diary notes and lecture schedules, small inconsistencies began to emerge, hinting at omissions or alterations in Penn's record-keeping. An overlooked date here, a misaligned annotation there, these minutiae, once connected, formed a lattice through which the past and present intertwined. The photograph was a node in this lattice, a tangible reminder that human actions leave traces, often invisible, until the patient observer uncovers them. As the evening settled over Oxford, I replaced the photograph carefully in its hiding place, aware that the library's quiet corridors seemed to breathe around me. I walked out into the damp air, the stones glistening under the fading light, thinking of the invisible threads that connect one moment to another, one person to another. The photograph was a fragment, yes, but it had begun to illuminate a story of ambition, of secrecy, and of subtle, enduring human vulnerability. And though its full significance remained just beyond my grasp, I felt the faint pulse of understanding, a quiet rhythm that promised revelation if only one listened closely enough. I recall the evening as a quiet intrusion upon the ordinary rhythms of Oxford, an invitation to a private dinner at the home of a fellow whose taste in both wine and conversation was exacting. The streets were slick with rain, reflecting the muted glow of lamps along the narrow lanes, and the air carried the scent of wet stone and distant chimneys. I arrived to find the table set with precision, glasses glinting in soft lamplight, the faint aroma of Bordeaux mingling with roast meats and polished wood. There was an elegance in these domestic arrangements, a deliberate care that spoke as much about the host as any speech might. Conversation commenced with the measured politeness of scholarly acquaintance, yet I noticed the subtle inflections, the pauses, the careful avoidance of certain subjects. Penn's death had been mentioned lightly, almost in passing, and the responses were telling not in what was said, but in what remained unspoken. A fellow recounted an evening of music, another spoke of a lecture, and I observed the slight tightening of a hand around a wine glass, the imperceptible shifting of a chair, as if to create distance from a particular remark. Human behavior in these controlled environments is never entirely honest, and the smallest gesture may betray a hidden concern. The discussion turned to the Don's private collection, particularly his rare bottles of Bordeaux. The wine was uncorked and poured with ceremony, and as the first glass passed my lips, I noted the conversation pivoting ever so subtly toward details of ownership and access. One colleague, speaking of the last bottle Penn had reserved, offered an account that contradicted the host's earlier description. The discrepancy was minor, a passing observation of dates and handling, yet in the careful architecture of Oxford courtesy, it carried weight. I stored it mentally, aware that small contradictions often illuminate the grander pattern. The host, an expert in the minutiae of taste, described the vintage with near ritualistic devotion, pausing to remark on the bouquet and its interplay with the flavor profile. It struck me that his attention to sensory detail paralleled the precision of his recollections about the Don, yet there was a subtle falter when he mentioned the final gathering at high table. The emphasis, the hesitations, even the way he swirled his glass before speaking, suggested a mental ledger balancing pride, guilt, and discretion. At one point, a minor gesture drew my focus to a folded napkin pressed with care, its corner pointing toward a guest who had remained mostly silent. The unremarkable alignment seemed innocent, yet its recurrence throughout the evening in the shifting of objects, the placement of cutlery, hinted at an unconscious signalling. Oxford is full of subtle codes, and I had learned to recognize them not as coincidences, but as echoes of internal deliberations. I remembered, too, the faint pencil marks in Penn's diary and the cryptic annotations in his lecture notes. The timing of the dinner, the wine served, the topics broached all aligned with the margins of past entries, forming a lattice of implication. A casual remark about a scholarship, delivered with a touch of irony, illuminated a rivalry that had otherwise been invisible, a tension threading through the polite laughter and shared memory. There was a fleeting moment, almost imperceptible, when the visiting scholar's gaze lingered on the wine bottle a second too long, the eyes betraying recognition, perhaps recollection, perhaps desire. I noted it quietly, aware that such small revelations, when accumulated, reveal more than declarations ever could. The night, measured and restrained, revealed in the nuances of behavior and in the subtle interplay of observation that human ambition and fragile ego are often at odds with civility, even in settings of refinement. By the time I left the house, the rain had softened to a drizzle, and the streets glistened with reflections of the gas lamps above. I walked slowly, the echo of conversation and the taste of Bordeaux lingering on my tongue, aware that a pattern was emerging, a lattice woven of words, gestures, and objects, subtle yet insistent. And though no resolution had presented itself, I felt the faintest pulse of understanding, a quiet rhythm that promised eventual illumination, if only one continued to watch, to listen, and to attend to the small truths hiding behind civility and refinement. It was well past midnight when the phone rang, its shrill tone cutting through the quiet of my flat with unwelcome insistence. I had been attempting the kind of solitary reflection that Oxford encourages, books piled haphazardly on the table, rain tapping gently against the window, the faint scent of pipe smoke lingering in the corners, but the call intruded like an unwelcome note in a symphony. Strange's voice, formal and clipped, carried the news of a missing page from Penn's diary, an omission that had come to light only when a clerk noticed an irregularity in the cataloguing of recent deposits. The timing, of course, was curious, for I had been pondering the photograph and the misquoted poet in equal measure, attempting to discern the faint lattice of motive that wove through the Don's last weeks. I scribbled notes while he spoke, aware of the quiet insistence in his voice, the subtle urgency beneath the professional restraint. The missing page, he suggested, might have contained something consequential, a reference to a meeting, a coded line, a fleeting confession. And yet the absence itself was equally telling. In Oxford, the act of concealment can speak more eloquently than the written word. It was a familiar refrain, the idea that truth is often hidden in what is deliberately omitted. After the call ended, I sat back and considered the implications, the room around me dimly lit, shadows stretching across the floorboards. My thoughts drifted to the various correspondences and diary entries I had examined, the penciled annotations, the careful crossings out, the moments where pen had returned to a page to make a correction or addition. The missing fragment, I suspected, was not a random oversight. It was removed deliberately by someone aware that the slightest detail might expose a private thread of resentment, ambition, or fear. I remembered, too, the subtle gestures I had observed over the course of interviews and dinners, the slight tremor in a hand, a glance that lingered a moment too long, a hesitation before speech. Such small things are often the footprints left behind by conscious effort, or by conscience troubled. And in the quiet hours of that night I traced the lattice of these observations alongside the absence in Penn's diary, noting how a trivial seeming omission can illuminate far more than a detailed entry ever could. The rain outside intensified, a soft pattering that seemed to mark time in irregular beats, mirroring the sporadic flow of my thoughts. I thought of the hidden photograph, of the opera ticket, and of the minor discrepancies in wine and conversation. All of them suddenly felt connected to this missing page. Perhaps it had contained an allusion, a code, or a date that could reorient the puzzle, a keystone in an otherwise elegant but fragile arch. The realization was quiet, almost imperceptible, yet it carried weight. Attention to omission is as crucial as scrutiny of what is plainly visible. I rose and paced the room, the boards creaking underfoot, the faint lamplight creating pockets of shadow that seemed to mirror my mind. I considered which of Penn's acquaintances had both opportunity and subtlety enough to remove the page without drawing notice. The student who lingered over minor details, the fellow who had gestured with a peculiar insistence at the dinner, even the seemingly inconsequential observations from the high table, all might be implicated, yet each possibility remained wrapped in uncertainty. The lattice of small actions, of gestures and misremembered words seemed more intricate than I had anticipated, and the diary page had become its quiet center. I finally returned to my chair, resting my chin in my hand, aware of the persistent rhythm of rain, the muffled city breathing beyond the window. The late night call had shifted the case subtly, introducing a new dimension that demanded both patience and care. Oxford sleeps lightly, if at all, and in its quiet corners the past lingers, speaking through omissions, gestures, and the faintest traces of ink on paper. The missing page, I knew, would haunt the investigation as much for what it concealed as for any content it might have carried. And as I sat there, the silence settling again, I realized that some truths, even when absent, have a way of pressing insistently upon the mind of the observer. I returned to Penn's chambers with a sense of deliberate purpose, the evening light fading through the mullioned windows and casting long, angular shadows across the polished floor. The air smelled faintly of old leather and waxed wood, the kind of odour that clings to rooms where books have been handled with care over decades. I had retraced these steps before, yet tonight something compelled me to slow my movements, to observe the room with renewed attention. There is a peculiar intimacy in revisiting a familiar scene, the way familiarity can conceal the smallest, most telling detail. My eyes fell again on the ledger I had noticed previously, its leather cover cracked and softened by time. At first glance, it had seemed innocuous, a record of academic meetings and minor expenditures, but a minor scuff on its edge caught my attention, a mark, almost invisible yet suggestive, of frequent handling. I turned the pages carefully, noting the sequence of entries and their corresponding dates, when a pencil notation in the margin flickered into sudden meaning. A set of initials, overlooked before, aligned with the date of a disputed lecture, and, curiously, with the date on the opera ticket. The coincidence was faint but insistent, a thread connecting events that had until now appeared unrelated. I allowed my mind to drift momentarily, considering how Penn had organized his life in layers of observation and subtle communication, each layer intersecting with those of others who shared his world. The ledger, the diary, the opera ticket, even the misquoted Tennyson lineal of them, now seemed to converge around this small, re-examined notation. It was a reminder that attention to the overlooked can illuminate the unseen, that truth often hides beneath the ordinary surfaces of habit. As I lingered, I recalled the gestures I had observed during the dinner, the shifting of chairs, the glances that seemed to mark unseen alliances. Each subtle movement, when placed alongside the newly discovered alignment of dates and initials, began to suggest a faint architecture of human interaction, a lattice constructed from ambition, pride, and the occasional pang of conscience. I made a mental note to consider who had been present at each of these intersecting points, for human behavior rarely leaves gaps without reason. My attention drifted to a corner of the room where the photograph had been discovered, leaning against a stack of books. It was no longer hidden, yet it still exerted a quiet influence. The posture of the figures, the measured tension in their expressions, the faint inscription, all combining with the newly aligned ledger entry to form a network of potential motives. I considered the young man in the image, the subtle connection between his presence in the past and the series of annotations in the present. The human mind, I reflected, is capable of preserving influence long after the moment has passed. I picked up the diary again, flicking through the penciled marginalia, noting where lines had been erased or overwritten. The missing page, absent yet present in the memory of the catalogue clerk, now felt central. The small ledger notation illuminated part of the puzzle. A meeting, a schedule conflict, a tension left unresolved. The link was faint but undeniable, a whisper of intent rather than an overt declaration. Oxford has a way of embedding truth in the quietest of gestures, in the slight deviations from pattern that only a patient observer will notice. A memory surfaced, of the crossword clue I had set aside days earlier, the one about distorted lines concealing truth. I recalled it now with fresh significance, considering the ledger, the diary, the photograph. Each represented a distortion, a partial disclosure, a deliberate concealment. And in the alignment of these distortions, the faint pulse of clarity emerged, not a full revelation, but a pattern, subtle and incomplete, sufficient to guide further investigation. By the time I closed the ledger and replaced the diary, night had fully descended, and the damp chill of Oxford had seeped into the room. I walked slowly toward the door, aware of the creak of the floorboards beneath me, the quiet breathing of the city beyond the walls. The re-examined clue had not solved the mystery, but it had illuminated a path, subtle and crooked as the lanes of Oxford themselves. In the hush of the chambers, I felt the faint stirrings of understanding, a rhythm of possibility that promised, in time, the slow unravelling of truth. I remember the high table that evening with a peculiar clarity, not because of the grandeur of the room, the polished oak, the tapering candles, the faint aroma of old wine, but because of the subtle dissonance that had always accompanied gatherings of Oxford minds. The Don, as he was invariably called, presided with his customary poise, glass raised in the ritual of toast, yet there was a shadow behind his eyes, a hesitation in the tilt of his head that suggested something withheld, a thought unfinished. Those present, trained in civility and the careful management of impression, responded with a blend of decorum and curiosity, their glances passing like faint eddies across the water, never quite resting, yet registering all. I observed the alignment of bodies, the weight of postures, the subtle flicker of eye contact, as one might trace the path of a minor current beneath a placid river. There was the fellow who had fumbled with a wine-glass days earlier, whose hand now rested too stiffly on the table. The visiting scholar whose gaze darted toward pen at intervals too calculated to be accidental. The host who had been so meticulous in arranging the dinner, now betraying the smallest tremor in his smile. All of these gestures, trivial to an untrained eye, hinted at the unspoken tensions that had accumulated over weeks of subtle rivalries, private meetings, and carefully hidden resentments. The toast itself, I realized, was more than ceremony. It was a message, precise and layered, delivered in a language that only those attuned to the Don's nuances could interpret. I recalled the misquoted poet, the diary annotations, the hidden photograph, and the missing page. Each had been a fragment, a hint, a partial disclosure. And in the quiet raising of the glass, the careful choice of words, the slight inflection in his voice, the pattern crystallized. The Don's final gesture was both farewell and admonition, a cipher in plain sight. A minor detail caught my attention, almost by accident, the shadow of a hand resting near the ledger on the side table, not yet noticed by its owner. It was slight, almost imperceptible, but it revealed more than words. A subtle pressure, a hesitation, a micro-gesture, a consciousness of observation, and perhaps a fleeting acknowledgement of culpability. The interplay of object, hand, and intent is rarely accidental in Oxford. I thought there is a deliberation to every act, even those that appear trivial. As the Don spoke, reciting a line from a forgotten poet, I noted the slight misalignment in rhythm, the altered emphasis. This repetition, slightly distorted, mirrored the misquoted lines I had catalogued in previous chapters, a signature of intention rather than error. Each listener reacted differently, some with polite assent, others with barely perceptible frowns, and one or two with eyes that betrayed recognition, discomfort, or perhaps fear. A toast, ostensibly a celebration, had become a subtle theatre in which loyalties, rivalries, and past indiscretions played out in miniature. I allowed the quiet of the room to settle into my awareness, noting the faint reflections in polished silver, the the muted clink of crystal, the almost inaudible sigh of a chair as someone shifted weight. There was the ledger, the diary, the photograph, and the missing page, all converging in this singular moment, a nexus where observation might yield insight. Even the smallest gesture, the flick of a wrist, a pause before speech, the turn of a head acquires significance when considered in conjunction with these artifacts. By the time the toast concluded, I had traced in my mind the sequence of intent and consequence, though not all was revealed. The Don's last words had been carefully chosen, layered with meaning designed to illuminate certain truths while leaving others obscured. I understood in that moment that human pride, ambition, and secrecy are rarely absolute, yet they endure, leaving subtle traces much like the gentle echo of a melody that lingers after the music has ended. I departed the high table with a sense of solemn reflection, the corridors of Balliol quiet now, the scent of polished wood and candle wax lingering in the air. The Don's last toast had not resolved the mystery entirely, but it had illuminated the lattice upon which it rested, the faint interplay of action and omission, gesture and intent. And as I walked into the misted streets of Oxford, I felt the familiar pull of observation, the quiet insistence that in the careful study of the smallest details, the truth waits patiently to be discerned. I walked the streets of Oxford that evening as the last light of day slanted across the stone, the towers and spires casting long, slender shadows that stretched across the cobbles like fingers reaching for some hidden truth. The rain had stopped, leaving a gloss on the streets and a lingering scent of wet stone and distant chimneys. There is a peculiar hush that settles in the city at this hour, a quiet that allows one to hear the rhythm of their own thoughts as they echo against centuries of architecture. It was in this solitude that I reflected on the case, tracing the outlines of Penn's life and death through memory, observation, and the faint trails left behind by others who move with discretion or deliberate concealment. I thought of the Don's last toast, the subtle inflections of his words, the careful gestures of those around him, and the layers of meaning concealed in polite conversation. Each encounter, each gesture, each marginal note in his diary formed a lattice of human intention that was at once intricate and delicate. Oxford, I realized, thrives on the interplay of tradition and secrecy. It is a city where civility masks ambition and where pride and desire may remain unspoken, yet exert a quiet force. The clues, scattered across lectures, dinners, and hidden photographs, had begun to reveal patterns, though some threads still eluded my grasp. I passed through Radcliffe Square, noting the wet stones reflecting the amber glow of lamplight, the Radcliffe camera standing sentinel in the dusk, its circular windows darkened but alive with memory. Students lingered in cloisters, speaking softly, unaware of the observations that the quiet eye might record. I remembered the ledger, the diary, the opera ticket, and the photograph, each a fragment, each a signpost, each hinting at motives, relationships, and the subtle shifts of power that define the human world. The connections between them were no longer elusive. They had begun to form a lattice of understanding, faint yet insistent. A crosswalk sign caught my attention, not for its function, but for the angle at which a student had leaned against it, head bowed, pencil tapping against a notebook in thought. It was a small, almost imperceptible gesture, and yet I noted it for its familiarity. In that pose was the echo of hesitation I had seen so often in the fellows, a reflection of the same small signals that betray intention when observed patiently. Even here, in the quiet streets, the human heart left traces, and I felt the faint thrill of recognition. I recalled, too, the minor discrepancies, the misquoted lines, the penciled annotations, The subtle conflicts over wine and lectures, the slight tremor of hands, or the fleeting glance that suggested awareness. Each had seemed trivial in isolation, but viewed as a whole, they traced the architecture of ambition, resentment, and concealed vulnerability. The lattice of human behavior is rarely linear. It twists and turns in unpredictable ways, and yet, when observed with patience, it illuminates the shadowed corridors of motive. I paused on the bridge over the Isis, noting the river's reflective surface, the way it mirrored the spires and trees, distorted and beautiful. The water, moving quietly, seemed a fitting metaphor for the case beneath a calm surface, currents moving with persistence, invisible yet inexorable. The city, like the river, carries memory and intention, shaping all who pass through it, marking them subtly, imperceptibly, leaving hints for those willing to notice. By the time I reached the quiet streets near my lodgings, dusk had deepened into night, and the lamps glowed more insistently against the stone. I felt the familiar ache of unresolved questions, the quiet tension between knowledge gained and mysteries remaining. Some truths, I reflected, emerge only gradually in fragments and whispers, in gestures and omissions. Oxford, in its patient, enduring way, preserves these subtleties, offering them only to those who wait, who observe, and who are willing to hear what is not said. I entered my flat, the faint scent of pipe smoke and old paper welcoming me, and allowed the day's reflections to settle. The lattice of Penn's life and death remained incomplete, yet the faint contours were visible, the pulse of understanding quietly insistive. And as night fell over Oxford, I understood once more that truth, like the city itself, waits patiently, offering glimpses to those who watch closely, listen carefully, and attend to the quiet rhythms that shape human action.